My name is Eric Gaskell, and you're listening to the Distorted History Podcast.
To speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter.
Shameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
A long struggle for freedom.
It really is a revolution.
Last time we covered the early lives of legendary outlaw figures Bob Parker, aka Butch Cassidy, and Harry Longabaugh, the Sundance Kid. We examined the fairly similar paths their early lives took and their initial steps to becoming outlaws. Now, Sundance's early flirtations with outlaw behavior didn't exactly go spectacularly, as he would be arrested following his first known crime, the theft of a horse, saddle, and a revolver. He would be found guilty of this crime and be jailed for 18 months, following which he received a pardon and attempted to go straight for a while. Lean times, however, sent him back into the ways of an outlaw, as he and two others robbed a train in Montana. This didn't exactly go well either, as not only did they fail to steal anything more valuable than $70, but they also apparently had not done a good job keeping their faces covered during the course of the robbery. As a result, descriptions on the three bandits spread far and wide, although the authorities didn't have to look far, as at least two of the men had simply returned to the same small town in Montana from where they had boarded the train in the first place. In other words, Sundance's early career as a criminal wasn't going so well. That being said, he had shown a propensity for escaping capture, as while in the custody of a sheriff following his initial crime, he managed to slip his cuffs and jump from a moving train. And after the bungled train robbery, he was the only one of the three bandits not captured and jailed. Bob Parker, the future Butch Cassidy, meanwhile, was much more successful in his first confirmed major crime, the robbery of the San Miguel Valley Bank in Telluride, Colorado. Despite bank robberies being significantly harder than train robberies, Cassidy and his three companions were highly efficient getting in and out of the bank quickly, stealing some $20,750 in the process. Cassidy's first major known job then seemed to have gone flawlessly, until that is they encountered a bit of bad luck while riding away from town, as by happenstance the robbers just happened to ride past a ranch owner that Bob Parker, the future Butch Cassidy, and one of his partners, Matt Warner, had just recently worked for. The rancher then recognized them, and when he was later informed about how four men had robbed the bank and had ridden out in the direction he had just come from, it wasn't all that hard to put two and two together. As a result, Bob Parker's days as Bob Parker were pretty much done. He was now a known outlaw who had just pulled off a daring and very successful bank robbery. As such, he was very much wanted by the authorities. Indeed, when we last left the future Butch Cassidy, he and his companions were still very much on the run after robbing the bank in Telluride. Yet before we pick up their story as they look to elude capture, first, like always, I want to acknowledge my sources for this series, which include Tom Hatch's The Last Outlaws, The Lives and Legends of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Paul Kuistra's Criminals as Heroes, Structure, Power, and Identity, Richard Patterson's Butch Cassidy, A Biography, Donna B. Ernst's The Sundance Kid, The Life of Harry Alonzo Longabaugh, and Charles Kelly's The Outlaw Trail, A History of Butch Cassidy and His Wild Bunch. And like always, these and any additional sources like websites that I used will be listed on this podcast, Twitter, and Ko-fi pages, links to which are in the description. And with all that being said, let's begin. By being recognized by their former employer, it was now all but impossible for Bob Parker, the future Butch Cassidy, and one of his partners, Matt Warner, to go back to working normal jobs as cowboys in the territory. That being said, that concern for the moment, however, was secondary, as they still had to make sure they evaded pursuit. As following the bank robbery, a posse was formed, and they were dead set on catching the outlaws. Indeed, according to Matt Warner, even with their relay of horses, something that would become a part of pretty much every one of Butch Cassidy's jobs, they still only just managed to stay ahead of their pursuers, who had ridden through the night while the outlaws had taken the opportunity to rest. The posse would remain dogged in their pursuit throughout the following day, even though the bank robbers managed to stay just one step ahead. The issue was neither side could keep this up forever. So to try and lose their pursuers, the outlaws would use a trick that, as pretty much every writer on the subject points out, would appear in many a Hollywood Western. You see, after capturing a stray pony, the outlaws would tie a number of branches to its tail before setting it off running down a different path than the one they were taking. The alarmed pony with the branches tied to its tail then created enough noise and dust to convince the posse that was the direction their quarry had gone in. They would then stay on the pony's trail well into the night, only realizing that they had been tricked when they finally caught up with the frightened animal, at which point they decided it was time to turn back defeated. Meanwhile, it's generally believed at this point that Cassidy and the others hid out for a time in southwestern Colorado before moving on into Utah. Yet, even with this, they were not out of danger yet, as even though the authorities from Colorado could no longer pursue them, it was still possible that those in Utah would take up the chase themselves. They had, after all, stolen a large amount of money, and with how efficient they had been, they were likely a threat to do it again. Indeed, as it turned out, while they were hiding in the Salt Valley region of Utah, the bandits would spot a posse that was clearly out there looking for them. It wasn't just one posse either, as according to Matt Warner's recollection, it seemed that there were multiple posses out there on the hunt, as he would note, quote, "From then on it was hell proper. It wasn't just a case of one outfit of deputies trailing us, but posses was out scouring the whole country, and we was running into fresh outfits every little while." One time, for example, they were almost caught in Whipsaw Flat. Things were already not looking good as they were heading for a line of cliffs while being pursued. It was at that point that they noticed an opening into a canyon, which at first glance looked like their salvation as it gave them another means of escape. They would soon realize, however, that this was a box canyon, meaning it had no other exit than the one they had come through, and it had sheer, nearly vertical walls. In other words, they were trapped with no escape with the law in hot pursuit. As such, the outlaws prepared to make a stand, pulling out their Winchester rifles as they waited for their pursuers. And they waited, and waited, and waited, until they had to wonder what had happened to their pursuers, who surely should have reached them by now. Well, as it turned out, the posse had indeed noticed the opening into the canyon as well. Yet instead of following the same path, figuring that the outlaws wouldn't willingly put themselves into a box canyon, the posse kept riding, hoping to reach the canyon's exit first to cut them off, an exit which again did not exist. As a result, the outlaws were able to leave the canyon the same way they had come in and slip away. This was their existence for some time, as they were forced to remain on the run. They had to stay on the move while making sure to avoid large ranch houses and settlements to make sure word of their location did not get back to the authorities. This also oftentimes meant they couldn't even risk building fires at night for fear of giving away their location, which all made it hard to rest for any period of time, and also hard to get supplies for both them and their horses. Indeed, it seems there was a stretch of time where they had to carry on without food. Just everything about this seems to have been misery. This included the very thing they were being hunted for, the money they had stolen. You see, the bank robbers didn't want to stow the sizable haul of cash and coins that they had made off with in their saddlebags, because being pursued as they were, there was a very real risk of having their horses shot out from under them, a situation which would mean not just the loss of a horse, but the loss of a portion of the money they had just stolen. So to make sure they would be able to escape with all of their ill-gotten loot regardless of the situation, the outlaws put it in money belts that they then strapped to their bodies. Which, as it turned out, wasn't a great solution, what with the constant riding and the hot sun beating down on them. Warner would describe the situation, quote, "The sweat would roll down our bodies and backs, and the hard, heavy money belts would gall a red ring around our bodies, and the money got heavier and heavier, and the sores raw and rawer every mile we rode till we thought we couldn't stand it any longer. More than once, one or the other of us let loose and acted like a crazy man, swore like a trooper, pawed at his belt, and threatened to tear the damn thing off and throw it away." Yet, despite these outbursts, the men would hold on to their stolen money, and after crossing the border between Utah and Colorado a couple more times, it seems that they finally lost their pursuers, at which point they took shelter in a location known as Brown's Park, a 35-mile long by 6-mile wide valley that intersected with Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming. Brown's Park was an area settled by farmers and ranchers who were more or less willing to look the other way when it came to outlaws, providing they kept their crimes outside of the valley. Basically, it seems that as long as you weren't stealing from them, they weren't all that worried about looking into your past, whatever it might be. As such, between its isolated location, the friendly nature of its inhabitants, and the fact that the area was a bit of a nightmare when it came to jurisdictional boundaries, Browns Park was one of the favorite hideouts for outlaws in that part of the country. The bank robbers were likely led to Browns Park by Matt Warner, as he had once raised horses in the region and was good friends with one of the ranchers who lived in the valley. Indeed, they reportedly stayed with the rancher for a time and in doing so, got the first good night's rest they had gotten since fleeing Telluride, as they trusted the rancher and his people to warn them should the law come riding their way, which it eventually did, at which point they departed for another hiding spot. They were then on what's come to be known as the Outlaw Trail. Now, this wasn't the only outlaw trail, as there were multiple different ones over the years in different regions of the country, with an outlaw trail being just that, a trail used by outlaws, which typically had places for them to safely hide out from the law. As for this trail in particular, it consisted of an unmarked cattle trail that ran from the Canadian border to the Mexican border. Along the way were a number of notable hideouts like the Hole in the Wall in Wyoming, which was named for a notch in a canyon wall through which stolen horses and cattle could be led through. Then there was Powder Springs in Wyoming, a stopover for rustlers that lay within sight of the Wyoming State Mile Marker 223 that marked the boundary between Wyoming and Colorado. And of course there was the aforementioned Browns Park, where they had already sheltered, and Robbers Roost in Utah, where they headed next. This was a region of winding cliffs and passages that featured numerous places for outlaws to hide in. It also lay tantalizingly close to Bob Parker's family's home. Yet as much as he wanted to find some way to visit his family, Bob would not risk it, lest he be caught or worse still, put his loved ones in danger. So he and the others stayed in Robbers Roost, hiding out on a mesa that was easily defensible and had access to fresh water. Still, after hiding out there for around about a month, their supplies started to run low. So Bob Parker was sent to the nearby town of Green River to get more supplies, on the assumption that he was the least likely of their group to be recognized. Unfortunately, Bob would be spotted by an old acquaintance of his, and so the bank robbers had to, once again, leave behind their latest hiding spot to stay ahead of any potential pursuit, doing so by heading back once again to Browns Park. Meanwhile, round about this time, Bob Parker, due to being recognized following the bank robbery in Telluride, decided it was best to start going by a different name. So instead of Bob Parker, he started going by the name of George Cassidy, borrowing the last name from the ranch hand and criminal that had first introduced him to this way of life, while George seems to have been chosen as to further obscure his identity, as a George Parker who had a bit of a questionable history himself lived in Wyoming. Regardless, while in Browns Park, Cassidy would take a job working as a ranch hand on the Bassett Ranch, with the Bassetts being one of the families living in the region who didn't really feel the need to ask too many questions about the strangers passing through their valley. Indeed, they seemed to have an open-door policy for any traveler who arrived needing assistance. Cassidy then was welcomed with open arms, and according to his sister's telling, he felt at home on the Bassett Ranch. They even had a library on the ranch that Cassidy was more than welcome to borrow from, and oftentimes did, as when he wasn't working he could oftentimes be found with his nose in a book. Cassidy was able to fit in so well in the community that he was even invited to a Christmas get-together with some of the families in the area, where he was much welcomed and delighted the children by bringing them all presents and playing games with them. He also seemed to have several potential girlfriends during his stay, yet for the sake of propriety, none seemed to want to come out and admit to such a relationship in later years. Now, how long Cassidy stayed in Browns Park on the Bassett Ranch is unknown, as were his reasons for leaving, as he reportedly left the Bassett Ranch in much the same way he left his own family's ranch years earlier, meaning he left quickly, thereby preventing extended goodbyes or giving anyone a chance to talk him out of his chosen course. A course that apparently took him to Rock Springs, but the primary opportunity for work there was working in a coal mine, which, unsurprisingly from what we know about life in a coal mine, was not appealing to Cassidy. As luck would have it though, while in town he would run into a local butcher who was in need of help. This was work that Cassidy could do, probably because chances are he had experience butchering cattle from his time as a cattle rustler. You see, in addition to branding stolen cattle, sometimes the rustlers simply killed and butchered the animals they had stolen to sell the meat to general stores and thereby eliminate any evidence of their crimes. It might be here then in Rock Springs working as a butcher that Cassidy picked up the nickname Butch, although there are multiple different explanations for the origins of the name. For example, Matt Warner would offer another version that involves an old rifle of his that had a huge kick or recoil that for some reason he called Butch. Now, apparently Warner talked Cassidy into firing the gun one day without telling him about its kickback. So when Cassidy fired the gun as he was sitting next to a waterhole, the gun's recoil sent him tumbling backward into the water. And from that day on, Matt claims he called his friend Butch after the gun that took him for a swim. Regardless of the origin, it was round about this time that he started going by the name Butch Cassidy. Eventually, though, he would leave the butcher shop behind to go work as a cowhand on the 240 Ranch, also known as the EA outfit, because it was owned by banker Eugene Amoretti. It was here that Butch met another young cowboy named Al Hayner, who, like Cassidy, had left the Mormon lands of Utah behind. The two young men then hit it off and ultimately decided to quit the EA outfit and start their own ranch. With Cassidy potentially providing a good chunk of the funds from his cut of the Telluride heist, the pair would purchase a spread of sagebrush flats and rolling hills in a region known as Horse Creek in Wyoming. Notably, this did not seem to be a great area for raising livestock. Indeed, it was such a rough area that not many people lived nearby. Now, this might have been a purposeful choice, as some believe this ranch was planned to be a part of a larger, if loosely connected, network of horse rustlers. You see, as the West got more settled, it became harder for horse rustlers to ply their trade. It used to be that to sell a stolen horse, one only had to go an estimated 100 miles away from the owner to sell it without much fear of getting caught. Yet, as the population in the West expanded and communities became more interconnected, the reach of large ranch owners and the various lawmen who were more or less at their beck and call grew as well. As a result, horse rustlers had to travel greater and greater distances to sell their purloined beasts without fear of getting caught. To that end, it's believed that various bands of horse thieves in disparate territories started loosely working together by selling their stolen horses to other horse thieves from different regions who would then take them back to their territory to sell them through the various connections they had there. The assumption then is it's possible that Cassidy's ranch in Horse Creek might have been a part of this network, a place where stolen horses could be brought, hidden, and taken care of for a time before being brought to a different territory to be sold. Regardless of what the true nature of this ranch was, Cassidy would write his family during this period, telling them about his venture, saying it was hard work and noting that they had 38 horses, but would have had more had it not been for the harsh winter that year. Meanwhile, when Cassidy and his partner Hayner weren't hard at work doing whatever it was they were doing, they were befriending their neighbors like John and Margaret Simpson, who recalled Cassidy as being very cheerful and quite helpful in keeping both their wood box and water buckets full. Come 1890, though, after they worked with their neighbors for the spring roundup, the two men sold their herd of horses and closed up the cabin on Horse Creek before riding off without explanation. Eventually, Butch Cassidy would show up in northeastern Wyoming, in an area known as Johnson County, a region known for horse and cattle rustlers, as thousands of head of cattle were known to have been stolen in the region during the late 1880s. Yet, despite or maybe because of the widespread nature of the crime, few were actually prosecuted. The worst area for this being the Powder River country, where between 1886 and 1889 alone, thousands of cattle were stolen while only 19 people were indicted, and of those 19, only a single person was actually convicted of anything, and even then that person only received a $100 fine. Likely knowing of the region's reputation, Cassidy then purchased some 580 acres of land that lay just 10 miles northwest of the infamous outlaw hideout, the Hole in the Wall. As he did so, Cassidy created what at the very least from the outside appeared to be a legitimate ranch, as he dug irrigation ditches and built corrals and the various other outbuildings one would need for such an operation. Yet, while certainly all look legit, given Cassidy's history as a rustler and the region's history for the same, it's suspected the ranch may have functioned as a kind of center for horse rustling, as stolen horses could be brought to the ranch and hidden among the others for a time, while they could also raise the stolen horses' offspring to eventually be sold as well. All in all, it seemed like a neat little scam of hiding criminal activity behind a veil of legitimacy. That is, it seemed like a nice piece of business until December 1890, when word came that the cattle barons had enough and were sending the law into Johnson County to crack down on the rustlers. Butch then, not wanting to be arrested and risk being identified as one of the Telluride bank robbers should the lawmen look close enough at him, sold his land to a neighbor and rode out of the region, likely hiding out at his Horse Creek camp since most everyone figured that property was abandoned. As it turns out, Cassidy's arrival in Johnson County was just a case of exceptionally poor timing. You see, for about a decade or so, the cattle barons and the very small homesteaders in Johnson County had more or less coexisted. Sure, the homesteaders resented the cattle barons, which was why they seemingly felt little guilt rustling a few of their livestock from their massive herds. Still, things were peaceful, as even with the rampant rustling, the cattle barons were still immensely wealthy. Yet, following the winter of 1886 and 87, whose blizzards created what came to be known as the Great Die-Up, which led to a significant drop in the price of beef, the cattle barons became militant. Most notably, the Wyoming Cattlemen's Association, a fraternity of wealthy cattlemen, opted to join forces with Wyoming's governor and 2 state senators. Together, they then passed a series of unfair and likely unconstitutional laws in Wyoming known as the Maverick Laws. These laws then gave the Cattlemen's Association the right to control all the roundups in the territory and the right to seize all unbranded cattle. Laws that basically guaranteed money for members of the association at the cost of small ranchers and homesteaders. Laws that were passed and remained in place thanks to the association's influence over the governor, legislature, and judges in the region. In fact, they even had connections with the President of the United States, Benjamin Harrison. Yet, as unjust as these laws were, they were still not exactly easy to enforce, so people continued to rustle cattle and brand them as their own in defiance of the cattle barons and their political allies, with the cowboys of Johnson County being considered the worst offenders. The situation in the region then just grew increasingly uglier and finally turned deadly in July 1889 with the deaths of L. Watson and Jim Averill. Jim, notably several months before his death, had a letter of his published in the Casper Weekly Mail, in which he described the cattle barons as monopolistic and hostile to the interest of regular folks. Indeed, he accused the Cattlemen's Association of being more concerned with generating profits for eastern speculators than benefiting their fellow citizens of Wyoming. Yet this verbal broadside was likely secondary to the fact that he had recently won a land dispute in court against one of the wealthy cattlemen Albert Bothwell. As such, when L. Watson and Jim Averill were found hanging after being kidnapped by a vigilante band, it wasn't hard to figure out who was responsible. In fact, the vigilante band that had committed the murders consisted of 6 prominent ranchers who, in addition to judging the pair guilty of possessing stolen cattle and passing sentence upon them, had been seen and identified. Indeed, one of those identified was none other than Albert Bothwell, the very same rancher who Jim Averill had defeated in court in the land dispute. However, despite multiple people witnessing the abduction, the wealthy men were released due to quote-unquote lack of evidence. A lack of evidence that very much seems to be the direct result of one witness, a young boy, dying mysteriously, potentially of poison, and another witness mysteriously disappearing. Occurrences which pretty much ensured that no one else was willing to testify. As a result, not only would the wealthy ranchers get away with literal murder, but Albert Bothwell, who had lost the land dispute to Jim Averill, now assumed the title of both Averill's and L. Watson's land. Yet despite these murders and the likely desire to make these men pay for their crimes, the violence in the region would abate for a time. Indeed, as Butch was paying attention to the goings-on in Johnson County after he fled, it seemed like he might have been premature in his flight. Additionally, according to Matt and Warner, the actions of the cattle barons against the small-time homesteaders and cowboys who were just trying to get by made Cassidy want to do something. Which may or may not be true, as author Richard M. Patterson points out. Warner had a notable, quote, tendency to justify criminal conduct by reciting lofty purposes, which, if you played Red Dead Redemption 2, should give you some Dutch van der Linde vibes. Regardless of their motivations, in 1891, Butch Cassidy, alongside his old partners in crime Matt Warner and Tom McCarty, all rode out to Johnson County to do some serious cattle rustling. As it turns out, though, this was yet again a case of bad timing, as hostilities in the region kicked back into high gear in 1891. In a series of separate incidents, 2 men were attacked and another 3 were killed. This, however, was clearly not just some random acts of violence, as each and every person targeted in these attacks just happened to be vocal opponents of the cattle barons. In fact, much like before, the individuals responsible for this violence had been identified, but after what happened to the witnesses of the previous murders, no one was willing to risk their lives by coming forward to testify, and thus no one was arrested for these crimes. Yet still, in the face of this unabashed violence, the people of Johnson County had remained defiant. In fact, rustling increased, as it had become all but impossible to actually convict anyone of rustling in the county, as no jury could be assembled that was willing to find one of their own guilty of stealing from the cattle barons, a situation that only made the members of the Cattlemen's Association feel more justified in their extra-legal violence. Violence which in turn only made the people of Johnson County more determined than ever to defy them. This spiral of violence and defiance eventually led to the barons hiring what amounted to a mercenary army, as they recruited and deputized 50 men. These 50 men were given a list of 70 rustlers they were to specifically target, along with a number of blank warrants that could be filled in after the fact with the names of the individuals they had shot and killed. That way they could then claim to have killed said individuals while they were in the process of resisting arrest. In other words, they could run up and kill Cowboy What's-His-Name and then fill in one of their blank warrants with Cowboy What's-His-Name's name and claim they'd been there to arrest him and he fought back. These heavily armed men then basically had orders to sweep through Johnson County, kill anyone they saw who might be rustling livestock, and only worry about the details later to make sure the whole thing looked legal and justified. Which was not good news for Butch Cassidy and his two companions, as they would find out one day when a group of 10 armed men came riding directly for them while they were driving a herd that consisted of some 50 stolen cattle. The three outlaws quickly abandoned the herd, their pack horses, and by extension their supplies as they fled on their own horses. This was not a fight they could win or likely even survive, as they were not only outnumbered but also outgunned, as the 3 men only had revolvers while the 10 mercenaries had Winchester rifles. Making matters worse, they were in the middle of the open plains, meaning there was no place to hide. All they could do then was run, but all involved knew they could only do so for so long. As luck would have it though, after being chased throughout the afternoon, come sundown, they happened to come across a rare stand of timber near the Wind River, a location that finally caused their pursuers some hesitation, as such a location potentially evened the odds for the rustlers should they choose to make a stand there. This sudden caution allowed Cassidy and his companions to make good their escape, as they had no intention of fighting. Instead, they kept on running and even split up to further lose their pursuers. Speaking of which, it was a while before the mercenaries realized that their quarry had not stopped and taken up positions to fight. By the time they realized their mistake, night had begun to fall, and the chances of finding the 3 outlaws had vanished with the sun. Cassidy and his companions had escaped, but they would not return to Johnson County to resume their rustling activities following this close encounter. Meanwhile, the town of Buffalo, Wyoming was soon alerted to the presence of this roving band of murderous mercenaries when Jack Flagg, a well-known and vocal foe of the Cattlemen's Association, managed to escape an attack on his homestead by said mercenaries. Flagg and others like him managed to make it into Buffalo, raising the alarm about this invading force who by this point had already killed 2 of their targets. The local paper, the Buffalo Bulletin, would call the hired guns invading their lands the Western Mafia, and the residents of Johnson County responded by organizing themselves and preparing for war. They were not taking this threat lightly and were ready to strike back. Indeed, within a day's time, some 250 locals had managed to surround a ranch some 15 miles outside of town, trapping the 50 invaders inside. Now, the residents of Johnson County could have likely sat back and laid siege to the ranch, letting hunger take its toll on the hired guns. The people of Johnson County, as it turns out, though, were impatient, so instead they constructed a kind of moving barricade to protect themselves from the mercenaries' gunfire as they moved in close enough to toss dynamite into fortifications the hired guns had constructed. Yet before they could actually pull off this plan, the U.S. cavalry arrived, having been dispatched by President Harrison, who had been contacted by one of the state senators about what was transpiring. As a result, the murderous mercenaries were saved. Now, the mercenaries were arrested and the authorities promised to put the men on trial for the numerous attacks they had undertaken and the at least 2 murders they had committed. As you might expect by this point, however, in the end, not a single member of this group was ever actually punished, because 2 key witnesses were bribed by the association to leave the region and not testify in the trial. As a result, all the mercenaries were acquitted and Johnson County was left with the bill for their trial and imprisonment. Meanwhile, the cattle barons didn't even follow through in actually paying off the witnesses, as they had given them bad checks that couldn't be cashed, which I guess is still better than being murdered, which was their previous solution to such problems. Now, of course, this is not the picture anyone reading most of the newspapers covering the story got. Instead, the papers that were controlled by the rich cattle barons cast the people of Johnson County not as the victims in this whole scenario, but as dangerous, lawless, violent criminals one and all. As for the residents of Johnson County and those in the surrounding region who knew the truth of what really happened, well, they couldn't exactly trust the law anymore, as it clearly served the interests of the rich and the rich alone. The system was very clearly corrupt, and so any who rebelled against the law, be they cattle rustlers or bandits, were more than likely to be cheered and supported than condemned by the people of Johnson County. As for Butch Cassidy, who had fled the region in response to being hunted by the cattle baron's mercenaries, he returned to his Horse River ranch with Al Hayner. As the two resumed their activities at Horse River, their neighbors couldn't help but grow suspicious of the pair, as despite the fact that the two men rarely had any actual horses on their ranch, they still somehow managed to have a not insignificant amount of cash to spend. So when the big ranchers in that region decided that they too were going to crack down on the rustlers in their midst once and for all, a trend seen all across the West round about this time, Butch and Hayner were well on their crosshairs. Butch and Hayner then unwittingly gave the big ranchers just the excuse they were looking for when they purchased a trio of horses from one Joseph Billy Nutcher, a known member of a band of rustlers. Predictably then, the horses Butch and Hayner had purchased were stolen, and so when the pair were spotted in possession of said stolen animals, that was all the evidence the ranchers needed to send the law after them. Yet while the big ranchers were clearly out to get Butch and Hayner, the two men were not without friends, and so they were warned that the authorities were looking for them. The two then fled their ranch and went into hiding, eventually taking shelter on a remote ranch near Auburn, Wyoming. They could only evade the lawmen for so long, however, as the authorities managed to locate and likely follow the young woman the pair had recruited to run to town and get supplies for them. As the lawmen descended upon the ranch, they managed to take Hayner by surprise and arrest him without incident. When it came to Cassidy, on the other hand, a more dramatic tale would be told. As the story goes, when the deputy approached Butch's room, he called out that he had a warrant for Cassidy's arrest. In response, the deputy claims that Butch answered, quote, "Well, get to shooting," which I'm not entirely sure I believe, especially since, according to this story, he would have issued this challenge without having actually retrieved his guns. Regardless, at this, the deputy burst through the door to the room, pulling the trigger of his revolver multiple times as he aimed it at Cassidy's stomach. The gun, however, failed to actually fire. Butch, meanwhile, was moving to grab his own gun, but by the time he managed to lay his hands on his weapon, another lawman was already in the room and was in between Cassidy and the deputy, which, according to this version of events, prevented him from getting a clear shot, as apparently he was only interested in shooting the deputy and not the other lawmen. Meanwhile, the deputy, who had apparently been frantically pulling his trigger this entire time to no effect, finally got his gun to work, as it fired a bullet that struck the suspect outlaw a glancing blow to his forehead, stunning Cassidy and allowing him to be taken into custody. A tale which I'm not convinced is not just a recounting of a frightened deputy who was just looking to justify his actions. Yet, regardless of how true the tale was, Butch Cassidy was finally arrested. Although in doing so, the lawmen of Wyoming had no idea that the suspected livestock rustler they had captured had been involved in a major bank robbery in Colorado. Cassidy's trial on the charges of horse theft, however, would be delayed for a year, as two witnesses were apparently unavailable. In the meantime, then, Cassidy and Hayner were released on bail. As he awaited his day in court, rather than making a run for it, Cassidy instead settled along Owl Creek, where it's suspected that he resumed rustling cattle, which, if true, would have meant he was likely stealing from the very same ranchers who were behind his arrest and prosecution, meaning that he quite possibly was making it so these rich men were also paying for his legal defense. A defense that would be provided by respected and well-known trial lawyer Douglas A. Preston, who had apparently promised to aid Cassidy in court should he ever need his services after Cassidy had come to his aid in a barroom brawl, potentially saving the lawyer's life in the process. As the trial finally got underway, though, it doesn't seem like Preston had to do much, as after the state presented its evidence, the defense simply rested, without introducing any witnesses or evidence of their own. Preston then was clearly betting that the state had not made its case, and indeed the jury would find that the prosecution had not sufficiently provided enough evidence to identify the allegedly stolen horses and their owners. Basically, it seems they hadn't even proven a crime had been committed. This outcome, however, doesn't seem to have been completely unexpected, as following this verdict, the prosecution quickly brought new charges against the pair for the theft of a horse that had not been named in the original case. Indeed, it seems possible, if not likely, that the horse was specifically not included in the initial trial to make sure they had another shot should they fail to secure a conviction the first time. The prosecution this time around would be led by Bill Simpson, whose family Cassidy had been neighbors and close with during his time at Horse River, and he would apparently be far more prepared than his predecessor. A situation that then required Preston to actually defend his client, instead of just resting confident that the state had failed to do its job. In doing so, Douglas Preston had what he believed to be a surefire way to sow doubt about his client's guilt in the minds of the jurors. Preston, you see, had a bill of sale from a known horse dealer in Nebraska for a horse that matched the description of the one that Cassidy and Hayner were charged with stealing. In other words, this document showed that the horse they had been caught with wasn't the one that had been stolen, but a similar-looking horse that had been purchased legally from this Nebraska trader. The problem was this bill of sale was a forgery, and the prosecution was apparently prepared to prove it, as before Preston could introduce the bill of sale as evidence, someone leaned in and informed the lawyer that the large man sitting in the fourth row of the courtroom was the man who had apparently signed the bill of sale, meaning that all the prosecution would have to do was call that man to the stand to prove that the document in question was a forgery. Having been prevented from playing this particular card then, Butch Cassidy would be found guilty of stealing a horse valued at $5, with the jury recommending that the court show him mercy, which the judge apparently did as he sentenced Cassidy to 2 years in prison instead of the possible 10. With that, Cassidy was sent back to the county jail to await being transferred to the Wyoming State Penitentiary. That night, however, Cassidy reportedly asked a deputy charged with overseeing the prisoners in the county jail if he might be let out for the night. Butch apparently had some business he needed to take care of before being sent away, but he promised to be back in his cell by daybreak. At this, instead of telling Cassidy no, the deputy supposedly asked the court clerk about this request, and according to this tale, the clerk responded that if Cassidy had made a promise, he could be trusted to keep his word. So Butch Cassidy was let out of jail for the night, during which time he paid a visit to the home of the very man who had overseen his prosecution, Will Simpson. He wasn't looking for revenge, though. Cassidy, you see, was friends with the Simpson clan, and he was there primarily to visit Will's mother and Will's wife, while also letting Will know that he harbored no ill will towards him for doing his job. Although, according to the Simpsons themselves, they never really fully forgave Will for prosecuting Butch. Regardless, Cassidy was good to his word and was back in his cell by daybreak, ready to be taken off to prison. Having failed fairly spectacularly at his first attempt at being an outlaw, and subsequently narrowly escaping the law even as his 2 accomplices were arrested, Harry Longabout, the Sundance Kid, seems to have been scared straight to some extent. Plus, it's also questionable how much his heart was truly in being an outlaw at this time, considering that both times he had committed criminal acts had seemingly been motivated by the fact that he was out of work and desperate. With that in mind, Sundance now once again pursued work as a cowboy. As he did so, though, he found that the job had changed quite a bit over the years. This was in no small part as a result of the Great Die-Up that had nearly crippled many a rancher back in 1887, an event that had put many a cowboy out of a job, with some responding like Cassidy and Sundance by pursuing less than legal ways to survive. Ranchers, meanwhile, after laying off many of their cowboys, changed the way they did business. No longer would they just leave their livestock to run free and wander the open plains. Instead, they began fencing in huge swaths of land with barbed wire. Additionally, they also had buildings constructed to house their animals in during the winter, as well as buildings to store the excess hay they now grew to make sure the animals had enough food to last them through the cold months. meaning for the cowboys their jobs changed from taking part in prolonged roundups to primarily driving the cattle from one enclosed area to another. Now, this does not mean their job was easier, as in addition to the typical tasks of branding and seeing to the cattle's various needs, cowboys were now expected to construct the various buildings that were now integral to the whole process. They were also expected to be the ones building and repairing the fencing, keeping the cattle in one location, while also being responsible for planting, harvesting, and baling the hay. As a result, one of the main appeals for being a cowboy, the level of freedom they enjoyed traveling the open range, was now more or less gone. Still, despite these changes, Sundance managed to live the life of a law-abiding citizen, as for about 3 years, he worked on a variety of ranches in Montana. For example, he would in 1895 start on to work with the N-Bar Inn Ranch, before moving on to work with the Beeler and Stonewall Ranches. As he did so, Sundance went by the name Harry Alonzo, adopting his middle name as his last in his quest for a fresh start. In doing so, he seemed to primarily have worked as a horsebreaker, wrangler, and ranch hand, work which he seemed to have been considered quite good at, especially when it came to horses. Yet, despite being apparently good at his job and generally well-liked, Sundance would find himself in a bit of trouble again. It all apparently started with some kind of disagreement between Sundance and his boss, the exact nature of which we don't know. All we do know is that it ended with Sundance being handcuffed by Deputy Sheriff Big Perkins. Now, Sundance would not respond to this situation by slipping the cuffs like he had in the past. Instead, he used the cuffs to strike Big Perkins in the face, something that did not lead to any charges being pressed, but would lead the deputy to suspect that this was not the first time quote-unquote Harry Alonzo had been in cuffs. Deputy Big Perkins then started poking around, reaching out to see if he could find out any information on this Harry Alonzo and his mysterious past. An investigation that caught the attention of the Pinkertons, whose less than legal tactics and activities are covered in far more detail in the remastered episode dedicated completely to them. Suffice it to say, though, that the organization and its agents committed everything from jury tampering, election fraud, witness intimidation, bribery, and even potentially murder at the behest of their wealthy clients. As such, it was likely quite unnerving when the Pinkertons descended upon the region, questioning just about anyone and everyone as they put more than a few people in their files for no other reason than they had been friends with quote-unquote Harry Alonzo, all the while also recruiting more than a few individuals to act as their local informants. In the midst of all this, however, Harry somewhat surprisingly stayed put, likely figuring that if he fled, it would be seen as a sign that he was guilty of something, and thus actively set the law on the Pinkertons after him. Seemingly then his safest bet for the time being was just to stay put and not do anything to further raise suspicions. Meanwhile, during this time when Sundance was trying to go straight, Butch Cassidy was in jail, the Wyoming State Penitentiary to be precise. Inside of a wooden stockade sat a structure with 2-foot-thick limestone and sandstone walls. This structure consisted of 2 cell blocks containing 42 cells that measured either 6 by 8 feet or 5 by 7. Regardless, 2 prisoners were held in each cell, where they slept in hammocks during the duration of their stay. Butch Cassidy and the other prisoners there were sentenced to hard labor, which meant his and the others' days were dedicated to tasks like making brooms in the prison workshop, tending crops on the prison farm, assisting in various building projects, and or cleaning out the barns and pens where the prison's livestock were held. Strenuous work that was supposed to, in theory, wear out the prisoners and make them more likely to obey the prison's rules. And for anyone who this didn't work on, well, the prison also had a system of strict punishments to deal with any such recalcitrant inmates. A system where even a minor infraction could result in solitary confinement in a windowless cell, and for the worst offenders, the prison also had a special dungeon, where inmates were placed in handcuffs that were suspended from the ceiling and were only fed bread and water. As for Butch Cassidy, his time in the penitentiary did not lead to any kind of rehabilitation. Instead, as is so often the case, it's suspected that it only provided the young outlaw with a more complete education in being a criminal. Indeed, Cassidy himself would later state that he had entered prison as a petty criminal, but exited it an outlaw. Which seems like a pretty fair assessment, as prior to this he was, with the exception of the Telluride job, primarily a cattle rustler. After getting out of prison, though, he would soon more or less leave cattle rustling behind, and instead pursue the types of crimes that would one day make him a famous outlaw. Now, Butch Cassidy's full sentence would have seen him remaining in prison until July 1896. However, few prisoners actually served their full sentence in those days, provided they were on their best behavior while in captivity. Knowing this, around Christmas 1895, Butch petitioned the governor of Wyoming asking for an early release, a request which was granted, and so on the 19th of January 1896, the, at this point, nearly 30-year-old Butch Cassidy was released from prison 6 months early. Once he was out, Cassidy set off immediately for Browns Park, the valley community that was known as a haven for outlaws. He had stayed there a time or two before, and it was now the home of his old friend and partner in crime, Matt Warner. Matt had settled down in the region with his new bride, an 18-year-old Mormon girl named Rose Morgan, who had notably not known about Matt's outlaw past, and which he did learn the truth only agreed to stay with him as long as he agreed to leave that life behind. Sadly, though, their story was not some fairy book tale, as even though they would have a daughter, the pair would separate again when Rose was forced to leave the ranch in Browns Park, not because of any recidivism on Matt's part, but because cancer had been discovered in her leg, a diagnosis that resulted in it being amputated, which led to complications that required Rose to move to Vernal, Utah to receive regular treatments. It was into this situation that Butch arrived after getting out of prison, as he provided his friend with some much-needed help around the ranch. Now, while Matt was trying his best to remain on the straight and narrow for his wife, Butch does not seem to have been quite as inclined. Indeed, shortly after arriving, Cassidy made a point to purchase a new single-action Colt revolver, plus he also quickly hooked up with an old outlaw acquaintance of his, Elsie Lay. Elsie was a reportedly intelligent young man who appeared to have been a reader much like Butch and Sundance, as he was known to take books with him in his saddlebags. Now, Elsie had reportedly first gone on the run from the law after he threw another man from the horse-drawn streetcar he was driving after the man in question had attempted to molest a female passenger. The problem was the man had struck the street so hard Elsie feared he might have killed him. So, rather than try to explain the situation to the authorities, he just went on the run. From there, Elsie, like Cassidy, had met up with Matt Warner, and in doing so, picked up some of his outlaw ways, as he took part in cattle rustling, some reported robberies, and reportedly even took up counterfeiting money from time to time. Yet, while it seemed that neither Cassidy nor Elsie had any real inclination toward going straight, it wouldn't be them but Matt Warner, the one who most wanted to put his outlaw ways behind him, or at the very least, the one who had a compelling reason to do so for his wife and daughter, who ended up in jail. The trouble started in May 1896, when Matt agreed to take a job assisting local prospector E.B. Coleman. Now, Matt would claim that he had only been hired to assist Coleman in packing up his mining equipment so they could bring it back to Matt's ranch where he would store it for Coleman for a while. That, however, doesn't seem to have been the full story. It seems that in reality, Matt had been paid $100 by Coleman so he would accompany the prospector and his partner into the mountains, which again may not sound like a big deal. The issue was the prospectors believed they had spotted a deposit of precious metal and were looking for its source, which again doesn't sound like a big deal, except that 3 other men, Dave Milton and brothers Ike and Dick Staunton, were also hunting for the same vein of precious metal. It was Coleman's hope then that Matt's reputation as a dangerous outlaw would scare off the competition. The plan then seems to have been to avoid violence, which would make sense and explain why Matt had agreed to go along with this plan, given his well-documented reasons to avoid anything resembling the life of an outlaw. Unfortunately for all involved, Dave Milton and the Staunton brothers wouldn't be dissuaded from their pursuit of the ore so easily. A gun battle then erupted between the two groups, which ended with both Dave Milton and Dick Staunton laying dead. Now, according to at least one version of this story, Matt made no effort to hide what happened. In fact, he reportedly actually aided the wounded and even sent for a doctor to come and see what aid they could provide. Yet, despite his confidence that these shootings were justified, Matt Warner and his 2 companions would all find themselves arrested and charged with murder. Now, nothing about this situation was good, but for Matt it was especially bad as, unlike Coleman, he had no money with which to pay for any kind of legal defense. Butch Cassidy, however, apparently had no intention of allowing his friend to go down without a fight. Indeed, in one version of events, he informed Warner that he was going to get him the best lawyer that he knew, Douglas Preston, the same man who had represented Butch when he was on trial, at which point Matt would have reminded his friend that he had no money with which to pay for a lawyer, especially one of Preston's reputation. To which Cassidy reportedly told his friend not to worry about it, as he would have the money for him in a few days. Following this reported exchange, Cassidy, along with Elsie Lay and Henry "Bub" Meeks, who Cassidy had likely first met back on his ranch in Horse Creek, Wyoming, all rode into the southeastern corner of Idaho, where, just across the border from Utah where all this drama was playing out, sat the isolated town of Montpelier. As the three men, Butch, Elsie, and Bub, rode into town on the 13th of August 1896, they looked at first glance like sheep herders, with only their two fine saddles suggesting anything different. The trio first stopped at the general store before leading their horses down the street where they tied them to the hitching post outside the bank. Then, round about 3 p.m., about a half an hour before the bank was scheduled to close, as one of the three waited outside with the horses, the other two, using bandanas to cover their faces, stepped inside the bank with their guns drawn. The pair ordered everyone inside, 3 bank employees and several customers, including a pair of the town's councilmen, to put their hands in the air and line up facing the wall. The apparent leader of the bandits, a stocky blond man, a description matching Butch Cassidy, then stood by the door keeping his guns drawn on the people, while his accomplice went behind the counter demanding that the cashier and his assistant McIntosh hand over the money. When McIntosh claimed they had no money, the robber called him a liar and struck him in the head with the butt of his revolver. The leader of the robbers apparently did not like this and ordered his companion not to strike the bank employee again. McIntosh, meanwhile, dropped the act and reluctantly handed over the cash they had on hand, which the robber stuffed into the sack he was carrying. From there, the robber moved on into the open vault, grabbing the money within, as well as a stack of silver coins that he spotted behind the counter when he exited the vault. As the man carried the sack containing all the bills and coins out to his horse, the apparent leader of the gang remained in the doorway, his guns aimed at the occupants of the bank. Then, once the money was secured to the saddle and the others were ready to ride, the leader of the bandits ordered the people to remain in the bank for 10 minutes as he left to join his comrades. Soon the 3 bank robbers were riding toward the edge of town at a purposely relaxed and easy pace, only spurring their horses to take off as they reached the edge of town heading off for the Wyoming border. Meanwhile, those inside the bank obviously did not wait a full 10 minutes. Instead, the cashier waited until he could no longer hear their hoofbeats before racing out to raise the alarm, at which point an impromptu posse was formed to pursue the bandits. The lawman in charge of this impromptu group, however, quickly realized that this wasn't a bunch of amateur criminals, but hardened professionals, as they seemed to know the best escape route out of town as well as places to stash relays of horses, as they had already changed mounts once at Montpelier Pass to ensure they stayed ahead of pursuit. And indeed, reportedly at Butch Cassidy's insistence, the trio had spent the preceding weeks working at a nearby ranch just so they could discreetly study the area and familiarize themselves with it for this exact purpose. For the lawmen, then, they decided that they needed a real posse to hunt down these likely hardened professionals, and not this bunch of frightened townfolk who had no real experience in using their firearms in a fight. Yet, by the time the new posse could be organized and set off on the trail of the outlaws, Cassidy and his companions had already gotten another set of fresh mounts, upon whose hoofs they reportedly placed leather moccasins, an old Native American trick, to further disguise their tracks in the direction in which they were heading. Exactly how much Cassidy and his companions got away with is unclear, but it's been estimated to have been around $5,000 to $16,000. Money that is generally believed to have been quickly deposited and then used to pay Douglas Preston and the other lawyers who were assisting him in Matt Warner's defense. Now, of course, Preston naturally denied that he was being paid using stolen money, and called such claims a, quote, malicious falsehood. Still, it seems to be generally accepted that Butch Cassidy was responsible for robbing the Montpelier Bank, and he had done so to pay for his friend's legal defense. It was then thanks to this legal aid that Ike Staunton, the one survivor of the losing side of the conflict on the mountain, was forced to waver while on the witness stand when it came to his previous claims that Matt had been the one to fire the first shots. With this, the charge of first-degree murder against Matt crumbled. However, the jury would still find Matt guilty of voluntary manslaughter, a crime which carried a sentence of 5 years in the Utah State Penitentiary, which, while not an ideal outcome, was still likely far better than it might have been otherwise. Meanwhile, Butch Cassidy and his companions were compelled to hide out, as the law suspected them of being behind the Montpelier bank robbery. The trio then hid in a couple of locations before eventually ending up in Browns Park for Thanksgiving, as they had friends there who were willing to shelter them, outlaws or not. Among these friends were the Bassett family and their neighbors who Cassidy, Elsie, and some others made a point of hosting a party for. The party included the whole traditional Thanksgiving spread of roast turkey, mashed potatoes, sweet potatoes, chestnut dressing, and cranberries, with pumpkin pie and plum pudding for dessert. In addition to all of this food, everyone made a point of dressing fancy for this occasion. The men, for example, whose mustaches were waxed and curled, wore suits with vests and bow ties. Meanwhile, the women wore tight-fitting long dresses and had their hair done up in a French twist or in a bun with bangs. 35 people in all were supposedly in attendance for this get-together, with Butch and Elsie, since they were the ones throwing the party, joining the ranks of those who acted as waiters for the other guests. Among those also in attendance and serving as a waiter for this Thanksgiving get-together was quote-unquote Harry Alonzo, Harry Longabout, the Sundance Kid, who was identified by Ann Bassett as Harry Rudenbaugh. This event then is pointed to as potentially the first time Butch and Sundance met, although there are also other suggestions when they might have met previous to this. After all, the pair had been geographically close to each other in the past. For example, Sundance's cousin's farm near Cortez, Colorado, where he first lived and worked upon moving west, was close enough to Telluride that the two might have crossed paths while Cassidy was living in the region, if even just briefly. Additionally, Sundance had worked for a time on the same ranch as Cassidy's younger brother Dan Parker, which is yet another notable time when they might have crossed paths. There are also multiple other times when the pair could have first met that are all to one degree or another possible, as we don't know their exact movements. Yet, since both worked on and off as cowboys and were thus driven about by the same forces, be they natural like droughts and bad winters, or the various economic downturns, there's always a chance they could have met up before this. Regardless, though, it seems to be generally accepted that both men were here at this event, and while we still can't say for sure if the two actually got to talking in any serious manner, they were now very much running in similar circles. As such, it was only a matter of time before they got to know one another and their partnership would start to form. Meanwhile, with rumor having it that the law was potentially heading out to Browns Park in pursuit of the Montpelier bank robbers, Elsie with his new bride Maud Davis, and Cassidy, who was potentially accompanied by Ann Bassett, who would herself in time be accused of cattle rustling, all headed out for Robbers' Roost to hide out for the winter. Come March 1897, as their female companions after a winter of isolation headed into a nearby town, Butch and Elsie were already likely making plans for their next daring robbery. The outlaws had their eyes set on the Pleasant Valley Coal Company, one of the largest mining companies in the state, and specifically upon their payroll office in the town of Castlegate in Carbon County, Utah. A town that was essentially owned by the coal company as it employed basically every man who lived there. Which is to say the company had a lot of people to pay in the town when they had their payroll shipped into Castlegate every 2 weeks by train from Salt Lake City. Something which was obviously a very tempting target for men like Butch Cassidy. The company, however, wasn't oblivious to this threat. As such, the day of the week when the payroll actually arrived in town varied, so as to not make it such an easy target for outlaws. A situation that then required Cassidy and Elsie to hang around town for several days as they waited for the payroll to arrive, during which time they had to do their best not to stick out like sore thumbs, as they were a pair of cowboys in a mining town that was not frequented by cowboys. Indeed, the very fact that they had horses would have made them stand out among a community who were oftentimes immigrants who didn't own horses. As such, it's suspected that Cassidy, Elsie, and their two partners for this robbery, one of whom was likely Bub Meeks, took jobs at nearby ranches, only riding into town on horses without saddles. Doing so would have made them look less like cowboys and more like men involved in horse racing, as horse racing was a popular pastime in Castle Rock just like it was everywhere else in the West, and horse racing was traditionally conducted bareback without a saddle. With this cover, the outlaws waited and watched for signs of the payroll coming in. Specifically, they were waiting for a special whistle that was used to signal to the miners that their pay was arriving that day, so they could line up and get what they had earned at the end of their shifts. As he waited, knowing that the payroll was showing up sometime that week, Butch dressed in denim overalls and a brown coat to blend in with the miners as he hung out by the company store, which was itself just around the corner from the stairway that led up to the paymaster's office. This was where Cassidy reportedly was when on the 21st of April he heard the whistle that signaled that the train carrying the payroll was arriving that day. Now, despite keeping an irregular schedule concerning what day of the week the money arrived, the company's paymaster E.L. Carpenter and his clerk T.W. Lewis carefully maintained the same routine when the money arrived. At the sound of the whistle, both men left their offices and headed over to the train station, where they would sign for the leather satchel and 3 cloth bags that contained the gold, silver, and currency that was to be distributed to the miners for the previous 2 weeks of work, an amount that on this particular day came to a total of $9,860. As the two men were striding off toward the train station, Butch Cassidy moved to lean nonchalantly against a building that sat next to the stairs that led up to the payroll office. Meanwhile, Elsie waited nearby, sitting astride his horse as he held the reins of Cassidy's. When Carpenter and Lewis returned, Butch stood up from where he was leaning, and just as the paymaster was beginning to put his foot on the bottom stair, he suddenly found the muzzle of a revolver aimed directly at his face, as the holder of said gun told him to drop the sacks and hold up his hands. Carpenter, the paymaster with the gun in his face, did exactly as he was told. Lewis's clerk, however, panicked and ran into the nearby company store, still holding onto one of the sacks that contained $1,000 worth of silver coins. Realizing that with the clerk running away, time was now even more of an essence, Cassidy quickly grabbed the satchel and the 2 sacks of money and tossed them to Elsie. Now, Elsie managed to catch the money, but in doing so, he let go of the reins of Cassidy's horse, thereby allowing it to bolt down the street. Meanwhile, as all of this was taking place in broad daylight, a number of miners were starting to gather around, curious as to what was happening. It seemed then that everything that could go wrong was, but Cassidy managed to keep his head as he pointedly showed the gathering crowd of miners his gun, telling them in the process, quote, "Don't anybody make a mistake. Everything's gonna be all right." Meanwhile, as Butch was addressing the crowd, Elsie managed to chase down Cassidy's escaping horse. Then, after allowing his partner time to mount up, the 2 men raced down the street, getting away just as a few of the Pleasant Valley employees in the payroll office realized what was happening. These men then grabbed the rifles they had on hand for just such an occurrence and began firing after the fleeing outlaws, but none of their shots connected. Carpenter, meanwhile, now that he no longer had a gun pointed in his face, ran back to the train station intending to telegraph the sheriff of the nearby town of Price about the robbery. However, he was unable to get into contact with the lawman because, as it turns out, the telegraph lines had been cut by one of the outlaws so as to delay word getting out. Not to be outdone, though, Carpenter ordered the train engineer to get a locomotive ready to take him with all speed to Price to alert the sheriff that way. As this was taking place in the train station, one of the miners got up the nerve to at least see where the bandits were headed, and as he did so, he found in the middle of the road one of the sacks which contained $860 worth of silver, and nearby was another containing some checks, both of which had been left behind by the outlaws to lighten their load. As for the gold and the other currency, that the robbers had apparently held onto, as they fled down what was seemingly a well-planned escape route, taking a path that bypassed 2 of the nearest towns, all the while regularly picking up fresh mounts along the way. In all, a trio of posses would be formed to hunt the bandits down. One of these posses would actually manage to track the outlaws for a while, however their pursuit would be delayed for a time as they lost track of which route the outlaws had taken. Still, they kept after them, but as night fell, fearing they might run into an ambush, the posse slowed down, thereby giving the outlaws an even greater lead. Meanwhile, the other 2 posses that had been sent out to pursue the criminals who had stolen the Castlegate payroll would run into one another as night was falling. Not realizing that they were on the same side, the 2 armed groups began firing upon one another. While they would eventually realize their mistake, they would not do so before they killed 2 of their own horses and shot one of their own posse members in the leg. Yet, even though the outlaws were able to elude their pursuers and would hide out safely in Robber's Roost, the law would still attribute the crime with reasonable certainty to one Butch Cassidy, having been identified by E.L. Carpenter as the man who had held him up. Now, unlike Butch Cassidy, who by this point had clearly embraced the life of an outlaw, his future partner Sundance had tried going straight after his own initial brushes with the law. He soon, though, would abandon that path, potentially being driven to do so by the same factors that might have inspired his initial criminal behavior. You see, the Sundance Kid's initial criminal acts seemed to happen in the wake of the Great Die-Up that made it hard to impossible for a cowboy like him to find work. The lean years, though, had passed, and since then it seemed that Sundance had not returned to crime. It seems telling then that he resumed the life of an outlaw in the wake of the Panic of 1893. Everything started when both the National Cartage Company and the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad collapsed. Their collapses sparked a panic on Wall Street as foreign investors started selling off their American stocks en masse, which eventually led to a stock market crash on the 27th of June. Banks across the country responded to this by calling in loans, while people responded by rushing to withdraw their money from the banks. And all this led to 74 railroads, 600 banks, and some 15,000 various firms all filing bankruptcy and essentially ceasing to exist. The devastation didn't end there either. Prices fell dramatically for crops like wheat and cotton, hurting farmers while unemployment rose 25%. As a result, by the middle of 1894, an estimated 4 million people were unemployed, which of course led to an explosion in homelessness as people were kicked out of their lodgings when they were unable to pay for their rent or mortgage. The end result of this would be 5 years of severe economic depression and labor unrest in the U.S., as this was also the economic downturn that helped to spark the Pullman strike. As for the effects this had on the West specifically, the Union Pacific Railroad had to file for bankruptcy and very nearly went down completely. Then there was Denver's mining industry, which essentially collapsed as its mines went bust. In Utah, businesses and mines were failing, and ranchers in Wyoming were also hit hard as well, as their wool was now selling for nearly half of what it was worth just a few years earlier. Cattle prices plunged as well in response to overstocking, competition from overseas, and just the general demand for a better breed of cattle and better cuts of meat than what was offered by typical range stock. All of these negative effects resulting from the Panic of 1893 could potentially at least partially explain why Sundance, who had seemingly tried to go straight after his latest brush with the law, was now suddenly inspired to resume his outlaw ways. As you see, due to all the aforementioned issues, wages for cowboys like Sundance had tumbled, a situation that ensured that unlike cowboys working in different times, Sundance would not be able to stash away enough money to start a ranch of his own, something that was likely high on his mind, as after all, Sundance was not getting any younger, and the life of a cowboy was likely taking a toll on his body by this point. Now, some have pointed to the bank robbery in Belle Fourche, South Dakota as being the point where the Sundance Kid became an outlaw again. However, author Donna B. Ernst points to a letter that had been written by one of Sundance's friends, in which this man, while updating his own mother on his life, happens to mention how a friend of his had been arrested for a bank robbery he could not have been a part of, as his friend had been working in Wyoming at the time when the robbery was taking place in South Dakota. Yet, even though it seems unlikely that Sundance had participated in this particular bank robbery, he would regardless soon leave behind his life as a ranch hand as he rode off for an outlaw hideout, likely Browns Park. It was here then that he hooked up with two of the outlaws who had actually committed the Belle Fourche robbery, Harvey Logan and Walt Puntney. With Sundance now on board, the trio intended to rob the bank in Red Lodge, Montana. In preparation, they got into contact with the town's marshal Byron St. Clair, whom they knew to some extent and hoped he could be persuaded to work with them. Specifically, they were looking to offer St. Clair a cut of whatever they stole in return for him being conveniently out of town on the day when they robbed the bank. St. Clair, as it turns out, though, wanted no part of their offer, and instead informed Sheriff John Dunn of their plans. In response, the sheriff organized a posse and set off after the outlaws. Meanwhile, oblivious to what was going on, the trio of would-be bank robbers were enjoying themselves in H.C. Jolly's saloon in the small, sleepy town of Lavina, Montana. In doing so, they happened to pay for their drinks using a $2.50 check that had been stolen from the Belle Fourche Bank 4 months earlier, thereby giving the posse a trail to follow. It didn't take long then for the posse to catch up with the three men who had stopped at a spring 20 miles outside of town to make camp for the night. Harvey Logan, though, was the only one in camp when the posse arrived and demanded their surrender. Walt and Sundance, meanwhile, who had gone to the spring to fetch some water, upon hearing the posse's arrival and demands, ducked behind a small bluff. As for Harvey, he responded to the demand that he surrender by rushing to his horse to retrieve his Winchester rifle, which is a no for anyone confused. A gunfight then ensued, during which Harvey was shot in the wrist, and ultimately resulted in the 3 men being captured by the posse. The trio were then brought to Billings, Montana, where they were imprisoned and identified as the men who had robbed the bank in Belle Fourche, this being the point where Sundance got wrapped up in that whole affair. But as mentioned in the letter earlier, he had not actually taken part in that robbery. He just happened to hook up with the men responsible afterwards with the intention to rob a different bank. The outlaws meanwhile maintained their innocence, claiming this was a case of mistaken identity, as they gave their names as Charlie Frost and Frank and Thomas Jones. This, however, did nothing to dissuade the authorities, and the trio were soon transferred by train to Deadwood, South Dakota, where they were placed in the Lawrence County Jail. During their time in the Lawrence County Jail, all 3 had their mugshots taken, or to be more precise, Harvey Logan and Walt Puntney had their mugshots taken, while apparently the photographer only managed to capture the top of the Sundance Kid's head. As when it came time for Sundance to have his mugshot taken, he resisted, and actually managed to duck down and close his eyes when the picture was snapped. Meanwhile, the trial would be delayed as Sundance asked the authorities to contact his friends in Wyoming who could testify he had actually been working there when the robbery was taking place in South Dakota. It was then round about this point that his friend wrote the letter to his mother talking about his friend who had been wrongly accused of robbing a bank. His friend, though, did not need to worry about riding from Wyoming to South Dakota because Sundance and his companions were already engineering their own escape. Things started when, round about 8:45 on the 31st of October, the local deputy sheriff and his wife, after attending Sunday evening services, visited the jail to check on the prisoners, at which point the deputy ordered the men out of the communal bullpen area and into their cells, so he could throw the lever that locked them in for the night, as was the routine. However, on this night the prisoners claimed they could not do as he ordered, as their cell doors were locked and they could not get in. At this, the deputy made the mistake of entering the bullpen with the prisoners with no backup other than his wife. Predictably then, as the deputy moved to check on the cell doors and their locking mechanisms, the prisoners jumped him, bringing the lawman to the ground. Meanwhile, as this was happening, Sundance was moving quickly to thrust his foot into the doorway of the bullpen before the deputy's wife could slam it shut. The deputy and his wife were then thrown together into one of the cells and locked inside. Now free, the prisoners exited the jail and mounted some horses that had been left nearby with supplies by Harvey Logan's brother Lonnie. Yet as neatly planned as this escape seemed to be, Walt Puntney and the other prisoner who had aided in their escape would soon be recaptured. However, when Walt was eventually put on trial, he was found not guilty, thanks to a pair of his friends testifying that he had been in Wyoming when the robbery had taken place. Harvey Logan and Sundance Kid, meanwhile, both made a clean escape. Sundance at this point then seems to have given up on his attempts to go straight, and while he had yet to be truly successful as an outlaw, he had shown a bit of a knack for it, as he had only really been undone by some incomplete planning and bad luck, which would change as he grew closer to Butch Cassidy, who was seen as a bit of an outlaw mastermind. The story of their outlaw partnership together and the gang that they led, though, will have to, for now, remain a story for another time.
Thank you for listening to Distorted History. If you would like to help out, please rate and review the podcast and tell your friends if you think they'll be interested. If you're feeling especially generous and would like to help keep this podcast going, please consider visiting my Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/distortedhistory and donating a few bucks. Anything you can give is greatly appreciated. I will be posting updates on future episodes and sources there in addition to posting them on Twitter as I usually do. With all that being said, once again, thank you for listening, and until next time.